When you think about the major concerns of philosophy, what comes to mind? Perhaps it's the meaning of life, existence, substance, the afterlife, being. For Emmanuel Levinas, the persistence of categories such as these is a mark of where philosophy has actually gone awry. Philosophy has historically been caught up in a process of totalizing, trying to figure out the meaning of life and totalizing it into a system that will be universally applicable and eternal. The problem with this kind of approach for Levinas is that it focuses on what he calls the same, whether that means the subject, the self, life, intentionality, and phenomenology, etc. Trying to find ways of understanding the world that start from a first-person perspective and end in a totality. For Levinas, this process gets things entirely backwards, and it leads us to be caught in an obsession with sameness, which he associates with totality, and with ontology, which is the study of being. So I'm talking here a little bit about some ideas from Levinas's seminal text, Totality and Infinity. If philosophy has largely been focused on totality throughout its history and has been caught in a kind of metaphysics of the same, he thinks that what we need to do is reorient philosophy. We need to reorient philosophy in the idea of infinity, which he associates not with sameness, but with the other. And this also, for Levinas, means that instead of ontology or the study of being, philosophy is first and foremost an ethics. It's a way of orienting us towards what is radically other, radically transcendent, beyond our grasp. And so when we think about others in general, we often think about beings who are like ourselves, right? You might think about a philosophy of empathy, for instance, an ethic that's grounded in the idea that another person is like me. They have a similar makeup to me, similar feelings, perhaps, etc. And for Levinas, this notion of ethics is misguided because the other is not somebody who is like me and by whom I also expect to be treated well. The other is instead what is radically beyond, what is out of reach. And so this is why he associates the other with infinity. Thus, for Levinas, ethics is not about rational decision-making or weighing options in the abstract. It's not even about relating to other beings because we see similarities, as I mentioned a moment ago. Instead, ethics is about responding to an other. So who or what is this other if they are, as we've said, radically beyond my reach? The other appears as fundamentally separate from me, as foreign to me, and as arising from a place beyond my own perspective on the world. I can never understand the viewpoint of the other. And so trying to put myself in the other's shoes is misguided from Levinas's perspective. Instead of doing this, ethics is about responding to the other as they present themselves. And a key feature of how they present themselves is as a perspective on the world that I can never access directly. On Levinas's account, we must treat others as other and not presume any shared experience with them. So the ethics that Levinas then proposes is what he calls the end of mastery, and it indicates that we are in relation to something that is absolutely other, an other whom we cannot assimilate through our own understanding or control. So in his methods, Levinas is deeply influenced by the tradition of phenomenology that one finds starting with Husserl and then developing in Heidegger and others. And one of the central insights of phenomenology is into the first-person perspective, this idea that instead of presuming some abstract view from nowhere, philosophy has to start from the perspective of the perceiver itself. Now, Levinas wants to hold on to the heart of that insight, but he disagrees with phenomenology's assumption that the first-person perspective can give us what he calls an adequation between being and representation, this sense that we can experience others directly through our first-person perspective. Instead, he wants to emphasize the transcendence, or what he will sometimes call height, this radical difference of the other. He says that phenomenology is a useful method for philosophy, but it's not the ultimate event of being. The relation between same and other is not reducible to a revelation or disclosure, whereas you find the theme of disclosure a lot in mainstream phenomenology or classical phenomenology. So he's still in line with the phenomenological tradition, but taking issue with it. For Levinas, this first person perspective or subjectivity is essentially founded in what he calls the idea of infinity. It is a welcoming of the radically transcendent other. Infinity is primary. It is more important, more originary than totality, than this emphasis on trying to explain things away and understand things completely, starting from an adequation between being and representation. So for Levinas, same and other are not opposing or symmetrical terms. They're not a formal opposition, since presuming that they are would already imply a kind of third person perspective on the relation between same and other, which is ultimately what he calls justice, but that's kind of a different story. So following this idea, Levinas says that the other is not other when one conceptualizes or represents it or imagines it spatially. The other is also not other when one considers it in terms of the other's qualitative differences from oneself, or counts their differences in terms of a quantitative difference from oneself. So alterity for him is neither qualitative nor quantitative. And he thinks that philosophy has, in general, through a variety of moves, reduced the other to the same. And the failure to account for this irreducibility of alterity has foreclosed the possibility of an ethics that would figure responsibility as a relation to the other as other, or absolutely other, tout autre in French. Instead, Levinas offers an ethics of alterity, sometimes known as response ethics in contemporary philosophy, especially in the Anglophone world. But this still emphasizes, as we've noted before, subjectivity, because subjectivity is the necessary condition for the possibility of having the other even make a claim on oneself. And Levinas's contention that ethics is first philosophy is quite a radical departure from the history of philosophy, where traditionally metaphysics or ontology is considered first philosophy, and then you can later get ethics, right? So ethics is often considered a secondary form of philosophy rather than first philosophy. And Levinas says this is indicative of the way that philosophy has tended to totally get things backwards. Now, I've noted that Levinas closely associates the other and ethics with infinity. And so you might wonder, what does he mean by that? Well, Levinas takes his notion of infinity from René Descartes, who in the meditations, in the third meditation, famously argues that infinity is the only idea that must have been implanted in us by a being other than ourselves, and that being is God. And so infinity, Descartes says, could not have been produced by human knowledge because we are unable to actually wrap our heads around it. So the very idea of the infinite is necessarily surpassed by what is ideated in it. That is, infinity overflows the idea of infinity. The idea of infinity is just one tiny speck of what infinity actually is. And so this leads Descartes to conclude that there must be a God. That is not relevant for our purposes. But for Levinas, one of the things that this means is that the very idea of the infinite in us is proof of the infinite exceeding us. And to use Levinasian terms, this is proof of its absolute exteriority, transcendence, and alterity. And so it's precisely the fact that what the idea of infinity is about, namely infinity, exceeds the idea of infinity that so intrigues Levinas. Because this conception of infinity allows him to figure the absolute exteriority of the other, the absolute alterity of the other, because it demonstrates how the same can come into contact with the other without collapsing it back into the same. Because keep in mind that for Levinas, the whole point of philosophy is to be able to apprehend the other as other without trying to reduce it to our categories of sameness. So again, alterity is not qualitative, it's not quantitative, it's not something we can grasp. And Levinas writes here, I'm just going to go ahead and read a quote from Totality and Infinity. The Cartesian notion of the idea of the infinite designates a relation with a being that maintains its total exteriority with respect to him who thinks it. It designates the contact with the intangible, a contact that does not compromise the integrity of what is touched. To affirm the presence in us of the idea of infinity is to deem purely abstract and formal the contradiction the idea of metaphysics is said to harbor, which Plato brings up in the Parmenides, that the relation with the absolute would render the absolute relative. The absolute exteriority of the exterior being is not purely and simply lost as a result of its manifestation. It, quote, absolves itself from the relation in which it presents itself. Still reading this quote from Levinas. But the infinite distance of the stranger, despite the proximity achieved by the idea of infinity, the complex structure of the unparalleled relation designated by this idea has to be described. It is not enough to distinguish it formally from objectification. And so describing it is one of the main points of this book, which, by the way, I don't think is very well translated. I have a lot of problems with this translation. I've written about Levinas in my dissertation elsewhere and often end up kind of retranslating some of these passages. But for our purposes, that reading was totally fine. In any case, you get the sense that Levinas is using the idea of infinity to conceive of the other as absolutely other. Now, the word that Levinas most often uses to describe the other is that of the face. And by face, Levinas doesn't mean a set of eyes, a nose, a mouth, et cetera, et cetera. He means that with which we are faced and to which we have to respond. He uses metaphors sometimes like the widow or the orphan to describe the face here. But for him, the face speaks to me. And thereby, this is also from the text, invites me to a relation incommensurate with a power exercise, be it enjoyment or knowledge. So the face is sort of the figure of the infinity of the other, and this other as absolutely other, right? But one other theme that is really important in Levinas's notion of alterity, and there's a whole section on this in Totality and Infinity as well, is that of eros. He thinks that the erotic relation to the other is where otherness most saliently emerges. And I've written about this from a feminist perspective in some of my publications, in at least one of my publications, because the way that he writes about Eros very clearly foregrounds a male point of view, and the other figured as absolutely other is the, quote, feminine. But suffice it to say that for him, the desire that we feel in an erotic relation discloses, or I should say, maybe reveals, maybe he would disagree with those terms. Because for Levinas, the desire of Eros orients us fundamentally to the alterity of the other. Desire is no longer desire if the other is grasped or captured, right? So there's something essentially inviolate, essentially beyond my grasp about an erotic desire for the other. There's a lot more to say here. But this is just a very quick intro to some of the key ideas from Levinas's Totality and Infinity. Check out the book if you have not already.